The Gilded Age, as we have studied, was a time of great industrialization. America was becoming richer and more powerful, but many Americans noticed problems underneath the surface. To some, big business ran roughshod over workers and corrupted politics. Workers struggled to make ends meet. Cities were full of examples of misery. The progressives sought to address these and other issues. The Progressive Era is the reform movement that lasted from around the year 1900 up until World War I. World War I took place from 1914 to 1918. Now, progressives sought to fix the problems they believed industrialization had created, and they used the government to reform American politics and the economy. Now, the idea of freedom prior to and after the Progressive Era was different. Now, prior to the Progressive Era, freedom had more of a negative connotation, and what I mean by that is the Founding Fathers and the Revolutionary generation and many generations thereafter viewed freedom in the negative, in the sense that freedom meant freedom from something. Usually that something was a government powerful enough to take your rights away. So when we say a negative view of freedom, we don't mean we dislike freedom. We just mean that means freedom from something. Now, in the Progressive Era, an increasing number of Americans started to view freedom in the positive, and what we mean by that is freedom to something. A positive view of freedom holds that you need something like an education or a good job in order to practice your freedom. This idea will really catch on when we get to the 1930s and talk about FDR and the New Deal. And this is probably one of the biggest differences between modern day conservatives and liberals. Conservatives tend to have a negative view of liberty. It's liberty means being left alone, having a small government that doesn't infringe upon your rights, whereas liberals tend to view freedom in the positive sense that government is supposed to do things for you so that you can exercise your freedom. Now, the presidents during the Progressive Era are Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. We'll talk in a separate lecture about their specific progressive reforms. Today I'm just going to kind of talk about progressivism in general. Now, America had changed a lot since the founding of the Republic. America was kind of an agrarian republic early on. Thomas Jefferson thought that this is the best way America should be. He said agriculture is our wisest pursuit because it will in the end contribute most to real wealth, good morals, and happiness. He famously said, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God," if he ever had a chosen people. Thomas Jefferson spent time in Paris, in France. He did not like what he saw of the big cities. Now, he's president from 1801 to 1809, so he kind of pushes this idea of the agrarian republic. But over time, throughout the 1800s, America changed. We have industrialization, urbanization, and a lot of immigration during the 1800s. Each of those posed their own problems. Industrialization, you had corporations that had become really powerful. You have bad working conditions. You have child labor, a new kind of child labor. Children had always labored. They worked side by side with their parents or their siblings on the farm. But now you start to have children laboring in factories where their parents aren't watching over them. It's just a different type of work. You start to have wealth, extreme wealth in the hands of a few. Urbanization had caused problems. You have the overcrowding of cities, poor sanitation, poor living conditions, a lack of adequate drinking water and decent housing. There was a lack of municipal services to kind of serve the people. There are also problems posed by immigration. Millions of people in the 1800s came to America. They bring lots of different languages and different beliefs. There's a problem about how to Americanize them. Immigrants contribute to the crowding of cities. They also contribute to radicalism. You have a lot of anarchists, socialists, and communists come to America during this period. Most immigrants aren't radical, but you do have pockets of it. Now, there's some different components of progressivism. I've kind of boiled it down to 4, but there could be more or less depending on how you count them. Basically, progressives believe or they accept industrialization, but they're outraged at the inequalities it produces. So progressives accept industrialization, they just want to lessen the negative aspects of it. Progressives have a faith in progress or science. They were big on using scientific studies to learn about issues like poverty and corruption. They believed that the experts had the solutions. Progressives often use academic experts and universities to think up solutions to problems. The progressives' solution to many of the problems is government intervention. One important area of intervention we'll look at with Teddy Roosevelt is that of trust busting. And there's also an element, a media element to progressivism. A lot of progressive reforms happen because you have journalists writing articles, going undercover in factories, seeing what life is like, and then kind of reporting to the public about conditions. As the public learns about things that are kind of the darker side of industrialization, they start to accept reforms as well. Now, a good example of a progressive would be Jane Addams. She's one of the more famous progressives in the early 1900s. She was a middle-class woman. She had a middle-class upbringing. She attended a good college, but she kind of said that she felt smothered by all her privilege, her middle-class upbringing. She basically decided to go into poor neighborhoods and help people. The way she came about doing this is that after she graduated college, she visited London, and she visited something called a settlement house. A settlement house is just basically a home that provides services to the poor, such as education, childcare, help in employment, and help in housing. The place she visited in London was called Toynbee Hall. This is where she kind of saw how the poor were being helped by these settlement houses. So she comes back to America, and with another reformer, Ellen Gates Starr, she starts the Hull House in 1889. This is started in Chicago. It's a settlement house. It provides services to the poor. Eventually it grows into some 13 buildings, and these buildings serve to help the underprivileged. Settlement houses start popping up all over the nation, and by 1910 there's over 400 settlement houses. And I want to read you a quote from Jane Addams. She says, "If the street is not cleaned by the city authorities, no amount of private sweeping will keep the tenement from grime. If the garbage is not properly collected and destroyed, a tenement house mother may see her children sicken and die of diseases from which she alone is powerless to shield them, although her tenderness and devotion are unbounded. She cannot even secure untainted meat for her household unless the meat has been inspected by city officials." So basically, the old way of reforming was through volunteerism, through individual effort, but people like Jane Addams and other progressives, they say, look, our problems are too big to just be solved by individuals. We need the government to solve them. Now, there's a lot of women that are progressive leaders. Another famous progressive woman was Florence Kelley. She was an early settlement or advocate of the settlement house. She becomes head of the National Consumers League in 1889 and later the National Child Labor Committee in 1902. She lobbies the federal government to stop child labor. She does have success in getting certain laws passed dealing with child labor and labor for women. One of her successes is an Oregon law that limits the workday for women to 10 hours a day. Now, this does go to the Supreme Court in Mueller v. Oregon, and the Supreme Court upholds the law. The Supreme Court says it's okay to pass a law that say women have a limit to how long they can work. And there was a progressive lawyer that kind of helped push this court case to be won for the progressives. His name was Louis Brandeis. He was a progressive lawyer. He presented a brief to the Supreme Court in the Mueller case. And he changes tactics. What he does as a progressive lawyer, he does not argue whether or not the law violated the Constitution. Instead, he argues the negative impacts of long hours on women. And this ends up working. The Supreme Court says the two sexes differ in structure of the body, in the functions to be performed by each, in the amount of physical strength. This difference justifies legislation to compensate for some of the burdens which rest upon her. So previously to the progressives, people tended to argue before the Supreme Court this violates the Constitution or it does not violate the Constitution based on what the Constitution says. Brandeis starts to pull out, sociological evidence, evidence for how long hours affects your life, your health, and he kind of argues that side, and the Supreme Court listens to him. There's another law that gets passed in 1619 called the Keating-Owens Act. This was a statute enacted by Congress that basically ends child labor, but it gets struck down as unconstitutional 2 years later in 1918. Florence Kelley kept on working. She convinces the Illinois state legislature to outlaw child labor. She also gets Illinois to provide public assistance to mothers with children. She gets a minimum wage law passed in Massachusetts. So she basically travels the country kind of advocating for women, for children, for consumers. Another really famous progressive reformer was Walter Rauschenbusch. He's associated with something called the social gospel. Rauschenbusch was a Christian minister who believed that Christianity should strive to bring the kingdom of God to earth by helping the poor. This becomes known as the social gospel. He writes a book called Christianity and the Social Crisis that gets published in 1907. Basically, he argues that Christianity should be less about saving souls and more about making the world a better place, often through progressive, reforms. Like I said earlier, one important aspect of progressivism is the media. In the 1890s, progressive magazines start appearing, and they often sent out investigative journalists to report on poverty or working conditions. There's two progressive magazines, Collier's and McClure's. They get started in the 1890s. There's some famous journalists that get sent out. Lincoln Steffens writes something called The Shame of the Cities. Jacob Riis writes How the Other Half Lives. Ida Tarbell writes The History of Standard Oil. Frank Norris writes The Octopus. John Spargo writes The Bitter Cry of the Children. William Hard writes Making Steel and Killing Men. And Upton Sinclair writes The Jungle. These are all books aimed at aspects of basically industrial society, urbanization, and kind of how we can reform America. Now, Upton Sinclair is probably the most famous of those. He's born in Maryland in 1878. He goes to college at a very young age. He's a really good writer. The newspaper called Appeal to Reason sends him into the Chicago meatpacking industry to basically expose to the public how terrible the workers are treated in the meatpacking industry. Now, he ends up writing a series of articles that gets published in the Appeal to Reason. And in 1906, these serial articles come out in book form. That book is called The Jungle. It basically shows how harsh working conditions are for the worker. It shows the unsanitary methods of meat production. And what ends up happening is the American public is so shocked by how terrible the conditions are, or how unsanitary meat production is, that Congress passes the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. Actually, the Meat Inspection Act is what had to do with the jungle. The Food and Drug Act has to do with another story. Upton Sinclair famously said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach," meaning his goal was to get America convinced that the workers were treated really bad. But when they read The Jungle, all they read about is how terrible the conditions of the food are. There's fingers that get dropped into meat. They sweep rats up into the meat hoppers. So all this unsanitary stuff goes into America's food, and that's what makes Americans upset, not how the workers are treated. Another famous journalist was Jacob Riis. He was an immigrant from Denmark. He arrived in New York in 1870. In 1890, he publishes a book called How the Other Half Lives, Studies Among the Tenements of New York. And he basically went through and looked at tenements, took pictures, wrote stories about how terrible living conditions were. Instead of blaming the poor for the living conditions, he basically blames the tenements, he blames society, he blames the lack of government regulation. One of the most notorious types of tenements was the dumbbell tenement, named after its shape that resembled a dumbbell. These tenements were 5 to 6 stories tall. They had 4 apartments on each floor, and they could house up to 150 people. One study found that they offered 2 square feet of floor space per inhabitant, and that's not very much. The bathrooms were in the basement of the tenement. Only the first floor had running water. They were not well ventilated, and the smell was often overwhelming. Now, in 1901, New York adopts the first major housing law in the nation. They outlaw the dumbbell tenement. They require windows in every room and an open courtyard. They also require tenements to have running water and bathrooms on each floor. Now, there's a name for all these journalists that basically talk about how terrible industrial society is. Teddy Roosevelt is giving a speech in 1906, and he refers to these people as muckrakers. Now, the term muckraker it's a derogatory term. Teddy Roosevelt is telling the American public, all these journalists focus on is the bad stuff about America. Why don't they ever talk about anything good? The term muckraker comes from the book Pilgrim's Progress. Now, in that book, there's a character who always looks down at the filth on the ground. He has his muck rake in hand, and he just always is focused on the negative, and he won't look up to accept this crown. So basically, he never sees the good going on around him, and that's what Teddy Roosevelt says these journalists are like. Now, there's a lot of laws that get passed, and sometimes laws come about because of great accidents. There's a huge fire in 1911 in New York City. It's called the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. Basically, it's a kind of a skyscraper where women make clothing, make garments. Fire breaks out in the building. The doors are locked. Many women die in the building. Some of them leap from the ledges to their death. The fire ladders can't reach up high enough to save many of them. In all, 146 women die. And you can kind of see some of these pictures show how horrible it was. After the fire at this factory, New York starts something called the Factory Commission of 1911, and they make sure that this never happens again. Senator Robert Wagner, Al Smith, and Francis Perkins, who will all be kind of famous people later on in the 1920s and 30s, they basically study laws in New York and factory conditions, and they end up recommending and passing something like 56 laws dealing with safety in New York after this fire. The progressives also continue the populist moral crusade over issues like alcohol consumption. I already mentioned the Women's Christian Temperance Union. There's another group called the Anti-Saloon League. Now, one of the most famous advocates of prohibition was Carrie Nation. She would sometimes take a tomahawk into saloons and start smashing things up. Some saloons would put up this sticker in the window that said all nations are welcome except Carrie, so they don't want her coming in there and smashing things up. Now, decades of activism finally paid off when in 1919 the 18th Amendment became part of the Constitution. Now the 18th Amendment is called Prohibition, meaning alcohol is no longer allowed. It prohibits the manufacturing, transportation, and the sale of alcohol. This amendment will be overturned once we get to the 1930s. The progressives also pass a lot of compulsory education laws. These laws usually require students to attend school until the age of 14. Now, in 1870, school enrollment was just under 7 million, but by 1910 it was almost 18 million. So during the progressive era, you get more and more children leaving the factories and going to school. Women's suffrage is also a big part of the progressive era. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the women's movement had some disagreement over suffrage. In 1619, they split, forming rival suffrage organizations. There was one organization called the National Woman Suffrage Association, and the other one was called the American Woman Suffrage Association. They finally put their differences behind them, and in 1890 they reunited, and they formed a new group called the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Their main goal was just to win the right to vote. Now, some Western states had allowed women the right to vote in the 1890s, but it's going to be until 1920 that there's actually a constitutional amendment. Now, women's suffrage was a very controversial issue, and there were men and women on both sides of the issue. You know, on the one side, men and women argue that women are equal to men and they should have just as much of a say in society as the men do. On the other side, you had men and women who said, If women have the same rights as men, that means they also have to have the same responsibilities. If women can vote, does that mean that they also have to be subject to the draft or other things that apply to men only? And they would argue that yes, that does mean they would be subject to the draft. So they are against women's suffrage. This is the same argument that happens in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s with the Equal Rights Amendment. There's a lot of people against women's suffrage that say it kind of takes two parents to run a household. One of them has to be focused on the worldly affairs, go out into the world and make a living. That's the man. And it takes another parent focused on the domestic concerns, raising the children, providing, food and clothing and nurturing, and that's the woman's responsibility. Now, not everybody believes this, but that's kind of the people that tend to be against women's suffrage. They kind of push that idea. And even some women that wanted the right to vote also felt that way. Two of the more famous women suffragists are Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. Now, Carrie Chapman Catt is head of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She takes over that organization in 1915. She basically has something she calls a winning plan. She lobbies Congress at the national level to get an amendment to give women the right to vote, but she also works to pass referendums at the state level. She has something called a society plan as well. She basically recruits wealthy, well-educated women to go out and give speeches trying to get women the right to vote. She speaks to lower-class women, tries to get them involved in the movement. She goes and talks to white women, to black women, basically get all the races involved. It's kind of an all-of-the-above approach. Now, a kind of more of a radical suffragist was Alice Paul. She's a social activist. She has her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She breaks away from the National American Woman Suffrage Association in 1917 and forms the National Women's Party. Now, this is a more militant women's organization. She doesn't really like the state-by-state approach. She kind of wants a fast constitutional amendment. She often marches at the White House, pickets the White House. She goes on hunger strikes at different times. So she's more of an activist campaigning for the right to vote instead of going around just giving speeches. There's marches on Washington in 1910 and 1913 advocating for the right to women to vote. Now, women's suffrage does end up winning. Now, by 1912, 9 states allow women the right to vote. And then in 1920, you have the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment grants women the right to vote. And in the first election that they're able to vote for, they vote in 1920. And they overwhelmingly go for Warren G. Harding, the Republican candidate. Now, the progressives also enacted a lot of political reforms during this era. I've got a whole list of them here. First of all, you have something called the city manager. Basically, cities start to appoint city managers instead of mayors. It allows the people or a city commission to appoint a professional manager to basically govern the city. It takes the politics out of managing a city. It's kind of a way to crush the urban political machines that were so corrupt. If a city manager does a poor job, he doesn't have to be removed by an election. The city commission can just remove him. You start to have the secret ballot and official ballots being used. We talked earlier about how voting was traditionally done in public with colored ballots, and they would be dropped into a glass globe, usually with kind of a slit on the top, so everyone can see the way you're voting. The progressives start to ask the government to end this and enact secret balloting. This is sometimes called the Australian ballot. And basically, during the progressive era, you start to have secret balloting. They also enact something called the ballot initiative and referendum. Now, these were policies supported by the populace. These allow voters to propose a law by collecting signatures or vote a law up or down that was drafted by the state legislature. You also have something called the recall election. This allows the people to remove an official accused of corruption immediately instead of waiting until the next election. You start to have the direct primary. Before the direct primary, the political parties would pick the candidates and then the people would vote on the candidates. The direct primary says we're going to let the people pick the candidates and then vote between the two parties. So that's the way democracy becomes more direct. You also have probably one of the biggest reforms is the enactment of the 17th Amendment. This is the direct election of U.S. senators. Now, here's how it worked before. Senators are elected by the state legislatures, not by the people. So you cannot vote as a person for a senator to go to the U.S. Senate. The founding fathers wanted the Senate to be free from the passions of the people. They wanted the Senate to take a long-term view of things and not worry about if they did something unpopular getting voted out of office, even if it was good for the country. After the Civil War, there's lots of bribery cases involving the Senate. There's a lot of states that bicker so much amongst each other they don't even send a senator to the U.S. Senate because they can't decide on one. So in 1893, reformers put forth a constitutional amendment that calls for the direct election of senators. Now the amendment fails, but basically it's reintroduced every year until it becomes part of the Constitution in 1913. So the 17th Amendment allows for the direct election of U.S. senators by the people. So now every state, when they send their two senators to Washington, they do so because the people send them there. So basically all of these reforms are an attempt to kind of bring direct democracy to the people. Probably the most famous political progressive reformer was Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin. Now he's a Wisconsin Republican, but he's a progressive Republican. He's governor of Wisconsin from 1901 to 1906, and Wisconsin is often referred to as the laboratory of progressivism. Under La Follette, Wisconsin pioneered much of the progressive political reforms, including the direct ballot, the initiative and referendum, the recall. The state enacts factory laws aimed at safety. They enact worker compensation. The state provides funding for education and regulation of the railroads. Now in 1906, La Follette is elected to the U.S. Senate, and he serves there until 1925. He even runs for president. His son takes over his Senate seat in 1925 and stays there until 1947. So basically from 1906 to 1947, there's always a La Follette senator from Wisconsin. One of the other big issues during the Progressive era is civil rights. And you basically have two very prominent African American leaders who kind of have a different take on civil rights. The most famous black leader of this day is Booker T. Washington. He was born in 1856. He was born a slave. He grew up a slave. He worked hard and ended up entering the prominent black college, Hampton Institute. In 1881, he became the first president of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Now, this was a school that trained blacks in practical vocations. Now, Washington is against racism and segregation, and he's a big player in the Republican Party trying to push civil rights reforms and legislation and protection for blacks. But he believed that direct confrontation would only make race relations worse and set back black people. He called for a policy of accommodation in education. He basically believed that as blacks became economically self-sufficient and more educated, they would be discriminated against less. Now, remember, if you don't know this, before the Civil War, it was often illegal in many states to educate blacks, to teach them to read. So blacks are denied their education. Usually that's one of their biggest complaints after the Civil War is, I was denied my education. So he says, as we become more educated, we will get more of our rights. Whites will start to respect us more. He outlines this view in something called the Atlanta Exposition Address. He gives this in 1895. Sometimes this is referred to as the Atlanta Compromise. He basically says we need to seek an accommodation with whites. Blacks should take a slow, steady approach to gaining their civil rights. You can't demand everything at once, so just demand it slowly over time and work more on your own self-improvement. Now, I don't want to give the impression that he didn't fight for legislation for civil rights. He did, but he just said it's kind of a two-pronged approach. I've got a quote here I want to read. He said, "Ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life we begin at the top instead of at the bottom. that a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill, that the political convention of stump speaking had more attraction than starting a dairy farm or truck garden. To those of my race who depend on the bettering of their condition in a foreign land, or who underestimate the importance of cultivating friendly relations with a southern white man who is their next door neighbor, I would say this: cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down in making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded. Cast it down in agriculture, mechanics, and commerce, in domestic service, and in the professions. And in this connection, it is well to bear in mind that wherever other sins in the South may be called to bear, when it comes to business, pure and simple, it is the South that the Negro is given a man's chance in the commercial world. It is at the bottom of life we must begin, and not at the top. Nor should we permit our grievances to overshadow our opportunities. The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly, and that progress in the enjoyment of all the privileges that will come to us must be the result of severe and constant struggle rather than of artificial forcing. No race that has anything to contribute to the market of the world is long in any degree ostracized. It is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. So that's kind of Booker T. Washington's view. The kind of contrasting view is that of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois was born in Massachusetts, and he attended Fisk University and Harvard. He became the first African American to earn a doctorate degree. So both Washington and Du Bois are intellectuals, but Du Bois is more of a, I don't know if elitist is the right word, but he goes to the finest colleges, where Washington kind of works his way up from the bottom. Du Bois takes a stronger, maybe more militant stand against Jim Crow than Washington did, at least outwardly. Du Bois argues that Washington's Atlanta Compromise will just be interpreted by Southerners as an example of blacks surrendering their civil rights. In 1905, Du Bois and other leaders meet at Niagara Falls to come up with a strategy to kind of counter Washington's ideas. At this meeting, they denounce the idea of gradual gaining of their civil rights. And out of this meeting comes something called the Niagara Movement that basically focuses on winning the right to vote, civic equality. I got a quote here to read from Du Bois. He says, Mr. Washington represents in Negro thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission. Mr. Washington's program practically accepts the alleged inferiority of the Negro race. Mr. Washington is asking black people to give up for the present time these things: political power, insistence on civil rights, and higher education for Negro children. So basically, Du Bois says, we can't really be successful in commerce or business like you want us to, Washington, because we don't have private property. Private property is impossible if you can't protect yourself civilly with the right to vote. So Du Bois says we need kind of a stronger, quicker, harder approach to civil rights. Now, a few years after the Niagara meeting, there's a huge race riot in Springfield, Illinois. This takes place in 1908. 2 blacks had been accused of murder and rape. They're arrested. A mob attempts to lynch them, but when they go to the jail, they find out that the sheriff has moved them to a different county for their safety. So this mob in Springfield, which is made up of thousands and thousands and thousands of people, they end up rioting. They attack the black neighborhoods of Springfield. They do lynch 2 black men and destroy many black homes. Now, it was later determined that the 2 black men that were originally arrested, one of them did not commit the rape. One of them was convicted of murder. But basically, this riot just shows how lynching often targets people who aren't even accused of a crime or who are falsely accused. But out of this riot comes the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. A progressive reformer named Mary White Ovington. She grew up in an abolitionist family. She was a settlement house worker. She's kind of appalled by this race riot in Springfield, and she calls for a meeting of progressives at the national level. And out of that meeting comes the NAACP. Now, the NAACP basically focuses on using the courts to win civil rights for themselves. So their main goal is going to be overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. And once we get to the 1950s, we'll see them succeed in that. But they do other things as well. In 1913, they launch a protest against President Woodrow Wilson. When Wilson becomes president in 1913, he fires many black federal workers, and he segregates parts of the federal government that previously had not been segregated. In 1915, the NAACP helps play a role in getting the Supreme Court to strike down the grandfather clause. Now, the Progressive Era did a lot of reforming, but there was also a very dark side to progressivism. This isn't usually talked about, but there was a movement in America during this time called eugenics. And basically that was a movement to fix society's problems through race breeding and sterilization. There were times where you could go to state fairs, and they would basically, normally at state fairs you get prizes for raising the best cow or the best pig or producing the best crops. Some state fairs in the Midwest started giving out prizes for who breeded the best children. So this was a very eugenics movement, who can breed the best children. There was a lot of beliefs during this time that crime and poverty and disease was not really due to moral choices. It was due to kind of biology. So people, like criminals, bred criminals. So if we can just stop the bad elements of society from breeding, we'll eventually breed out all the bad things that are in humans. President Woodrow Wilson was a strong believer in eugenics. Now, he's governor of New Jersey before he becomes president of the United States. As New Jersey's governor, he helped create the Board of Examiners of Feeble-Minded, Epileptics, and Other Defectives. Basically, this board would determine when procreation was inadvisable. So you did have forced sterilizations throughout the United States when the government authorities basically believe this person is not fit to reproduce. Margaret Sanger was kind of big involvement in the eugenics movement. Now, she's most famously known for advocating for birth control. She was founder of something called the American Birth Control League, and that later becomes the organization Planned Parenthood. She would get letters from women talking about how they had so many children and how hard their lives were. So she believed that mothers are strained with the amount of children they had, so that's why she fights for access to birth control. She gets arrested numerous times. In her book, The Pivot of Civilization, she says this: "The emergency problem of segregation and sterilization must be faced immediately. Every feeble-minded girl or woman should be segregated during their reproductive period. We prefer the policy of immediate sterilization, of making sure that parenthood is absolutely prohibited to the feeble-minded." She explained that eugenics was a way to cultivate the better racial elements in society. It would gradually suppress, eliminate, and exterminate the defective stock. She called the defective stock human weeds, which threatened kind of the best civilization had to offer. She gave a speech one time at the women of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. She worked with something called the Negro Project, which basically worked to bring birth control and other eugenics methods to the black community. She used black ministers to sell the idea of birth control and eugenics to the community. She said in a letter one time, "We do not want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten that idea if it ever occurs to any of the more rebellious members." Now, there's a really famous Supreme Court case a little bit after the Progressive Era, but it kind of stems from progressivism. It's called Buck v. Bell, and it's decided in 1927, and it revolves around this young woman named Carrie Buck. She was an inmate of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. Now, the institution decides that they want to sterilize Buck so that they don't create more feeble-minded people like her, and that's what the institution recommends. This case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that the state can forcibly sterilize Carrie Buck. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. writes the majority opinion, and this is a very famous quote from that opinion. He says, "Carrie Buck is a feeble-minded white woman who was committed to the state colony. We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sapped the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." So basically, we don't want any more imbeciles, so let's stop her from reproducing. So the eugenics movement is kind of this dark period in American and progressive history. There's a whole book about it that I recommend if this is kind of something you're interested in. It's called War Against the Weak, Eugenics and America's Campaign to Create a Master Race. It's by Edwin Black. And the more you kind of dig into this, the Nazis got a lot of their ideas from kind of the eugenics movement in America, some of it from England as well. But this is a really interesting book to check out if you're kind of interested in more of this. So next time we'll kind of talk about Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, and how they acted during this progressive era.